What would you do if your integrity was tested by the very people meant to uplift you? For James Carter, a young black student with dreams bigger than his circumstances, an unjust suspension wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a journey that would leave an entire school stunned. The bell rang sharply at Lincoln High School, signaling the start of the lunch hour. Students poured into the cafeteria, the air filled with chatter, laughter, and the clatter of trays. Among them was James Carter, a diligent senior known for his kind nature and dedication to his studies. With his broad smile and a backpack slung casually over one shoulder, James was the kind of student teachers admired and peers respected, but not everyone saw him that way. At one of the tables, a tense argument broke out between two younger students. Voices rose, drawing attention from nearby groups. James, noticing the commotion, stepped forward. "Hey, guys," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Let's talk this out. This isn't worth getting into trouble over." Just as he began to diffuse the situation, the cafeteria doors swung open, and Principal Richard Porter strode in. His presence immediately silenced much of the room. With his graying hair and rigid posture, Porter carried himself with an air of authority, though it often came tinged with arrogance. He prided himself on maintaining discipline, but his methods were often questionable, especially when it came to students like James. Porter's sharp eyes landed on the scene. Without pausing to understand the situation, he pointed at James. "Carter, my office, now!" James froze, the students around him exchanging nervous glances. "But sir, I was just trying to—" "Now!" Porter barked, cutting him off. His tone left no room for discussion. The cafeteria buzzed with murmurs as James reluctantly followed Porter out, his heart pounding with a mix of confusion and frustration. In the principal's office, Porter wasted no time. "You were causing a disruption in the cafeteria," he said, his tone cold and accusatory. James frowned, his voice steady but firm. "I wasn't causing a disruption, sir. I was trying to stop one. Two students were arguing, and I stepped in to help." Porter leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Is that so? Because from where I stood, it looked like you were right in the middle of it." James's jaw tightened. "I was trying to de-escalate the situation. Ask anyone who was there." But Porter wasn't interested in hearing more. He tapped his pen against the desk, his decision already made. "This school has a zero-tolerance policy for disruptions. You're suspended for 3 days, effective immediately." James felt the words hit like a punch to the gut. "Suspended? Sir, this isn't fair. I didn't do anything wrong." Porter's gaze hardened. "That's enough, Carter. The decision is final. You're dismissed." James left the office, his head spinning. The injustice of the situation burned in his chest, but he knew arguing further would only make things worse. Outside, his best friend Mia was waiting, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked, falling into step beside him. "He suspended me," James said quietly, his voice laced with disbelief. "What? For what?" Mia exclaimed, her voice rising. James shook his head. "For doing the right thing, apparently." The weight of the suspension loomed over him, threatening to derail everything he had worked so hard for. But James wasn't the type to give up easily. He would fight back, not with anger, but with the integrity and resilience that defined him. James Carter walked home from school that day with a heavy heart, the suspension notice crumpled in his hand. The weight of the injustice pressed on him, filling his mind with doubt and frustration. He thought about everything he'd worked for, his GPA, his leadership in the school's mentorship program, his dreams of college. All of it now felt precarious, as though one unfair decision had the power to erase years of effort. At home, James's mother, Clara, was waiting for him. A single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her family, Clara had always taught James to stand tall in the face of adversity. But when she saw the look on her son's face, her heart sank. "What happened, James?" she asked, concern etched in her voice. James hesitated before handing her the notice. Clara read it quickly, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Suspended? For what?" "They said I was causing a disruption," James explained, frustration breaking through his usually calm demeanor. "But I wasn't, Mom. I was trying to stop a fight." Clara's eyes flashed with anger. "This isn't right," she said firmly. You've done nothing wrong and they're punishing you? We're going to fight this." The next day, Clara marched into the school with James by her side, determined to demand answers. Principal Porter greeted them in his office with his usual air of superiority, his posture stiff as he gestured for them to sit. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you're upset," he began, his tone condescending. "But we have rules, and James violated them." Clara's voice was steady, but her anger was evident. "James was trying to help. Why are you punishing him for doing the right thing?" Porter leaned back in his chair, his expression indifferent. "The school has a zero-tolerance policy for disruptions. It's not about intent. It's about maintaining order." Clara wasn't having it. Order? By punishing a student who was trying to stop a fight? That's not order, it's bias. Porter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Clara stood, her voice unwavering. "We'll appeal this to the school board if we have to. My son will not be punished for your lack of judgment." As they left the office, James felt a flicker of hope, bolstered by his mother's fierce determination. But the weight of the suspension still lingered, especially as the news spread through the school. At first, many students were too afraid to speak out, worried about the consequences of opposing Porter. But James's closest friends, including Mia, rallied around him. Mia took to social media, sharing what had happened and encouraging others to stand with James. "This isn't just about James," she wrote in a post that quickly gained traction. "It's about standing up to unfair treatment and supporting what's right." The post sparked a wave of support. Students began speaking up, sharing their own stories of feeling overlooked or unfairly treated by Porter. Teachers who had quietly disagreed with Porter's methods for years finally felt emboldened to voice their concerns. Despite the growing support, James couldn't shake the humiliation of being suspended. He stayed home, pouring his energy into schoolwork and a community service project he'd been planning for months. The project, a fundraiser for underprivileged students, gave him a sense of purpose amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, Clara worked tirelessly to build a case for the appeal, gathering statements from witnesses and teachers who could vouch for James's character. The more evidence she uncovered, the clearer it became that Porter's decision had been influenced by bias, not facts. At school, the atmosphere was shifting. Students whispered about James's resilience, and many began to see him as a symbol of resistance against unfair authority. Even some of the teachers started subtly encouraging their classes to stand up for what was right. But Principal Porter remained unyielding, confident that his authority would protect him from accountability. What he didn't realize was that the tide was turning, and James's quiet determination was about to spark a movement he couldn't control. James Carter had every reason to feel defeated, but giving up wasn't in his nature. His mother's relentless support and the encouragement of his friends fueled his resolve. Instead of letting the suspension define him, James decided to prove his worth through actions, not words. The first step was the fundraiser he had been organizing long before the incident. The initiative aimed to provide school supplies for underprivileged students in the community. Despite being at home during his suspension, James doubled his efforts to ensure its success. He reached out to local businesses for sponsorships, designed promotional materials, and coordinated with Mia to spread the word online. As the fundraiser gained momentum, it became more than just a community event. It became a symbol of James's character, a clear contradiction to the narrative Principal Porter had tried to impose on him. Meanwhile, at school, Mia's campaign to share James's story continued to grow. She organized a petition calling for the school board to investigate Porter's actions and reevaluate James's suspension. Students began signing it in droves, emboldened by James's example. "James isn't just a good student," Mia said in a video she posted online. "He's a leader. He's someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's the kind of person our school should celebrate, not punish." The video went viral within the local community, drawing the attention of parents, teachers, and even local media. A reporter reached out to James for an interview, and though he hesitated at first, he eventually agreed. Sitting in his living room, James spoke candidly about the incident. "I'm not angry," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I just want people to know that standing up for what's right is worth it, even when it feels like the world is against you." The interview aired on the evening news, further amplifying James's story. Viewers were moved by his maturity and determination, and support continued to pour in. Donations to the fundraiser skyrocketed, and several community leaders publicly commended James for his resilience. One of those leaders was Mr. Ramirez, a history teacher who had long been an advocate for fairness and equality. He visited James at home to offer his support. "What you're doing," he said, "is inspiring more people than you realize. Keep going." James took those words to heart. With the fundraiser just days away, he worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was perfect. On the day of the event, hundreds of people showed up, including students, teachers, and families from the community. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of hope and unity. James gave a short speech, thanking everyone for their support and emphasizing the importance of helping one another. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all of us working together to make a difference." The event raised more money than James had ever expected, enough to provide supplies for dozens of students and fund additional community programs. But more than that, it showcased James's strength of character and his ability to turn adversity into something positive. Back at school, the narrative was shifting. James wasn't just the student who had been unfairly suspended, he was a role model. Even teachers who had remained neutral began to speak out, subtly challenging Principal Porter's authority. But Porter wasn't ready to back down. Though he could see the growing tide of support for James, his pride and prejudice kept him from admitting he was wrong. What Porter didn't realize was that the evidence against him was mounting, and James's unwavering resolve was about to bring the truth to light. The morning of the school board hearing dawned with an air of anticipation. Clara Carter, armed with a thick file of evidence, walked confidently into the meeting room, her son James at her side. Mia and a small group of students were already seated in support, their presence a quiet testament to the unity James had inspired. Principal Porter, however, sat stiffly at the end of the room, his demeanor as rigid as ever, though a flicker of unease crossed his face when he saw the crowd gathering. The hearing began with Clara presenting her case. She opened with a calm yet determined tone, recounting the events leading to James's suspension. "My son stepped in to stop a fight, yet he was punished without proper investigation. This suspension has not only harmed his record, but has also sent a troubling message to the students of this school." The school board members listened attentively as Clara continued. Then came the pivotal moment. Mia rose to speak, holding her phone in her hand. "I have video evidence that proves James wasn't causing a disruption. He was trying to prevent one." She played the footage, captured by a student who had witnessed the cafeteria altercation. The video clearly showed James calmly intervening, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The two arguing students nodded as he spoke, visibly calming down. Then came the abrupt arrival of Principal Porter, who pointed directly at James without asking any questions. The room fell silent as the video ended. One of the board members cleared her throat, her expression troubled. "Mr. Porter, do you have any explanation for your actions in this footage?" Porter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence faltering. "The situation appeared to be escalating," he said, his tone defensive. "I made a judgment call to maintain order." Clara didn't let the statement go unchallenged. A judgment call? Without speaking to witnesses or gathering facts? This was more than a poor decision. It was bias. Murmurs rippled through the room as Clara's words hit their mark. A teacher who had been quietly observing stood up. "I've worked at this school for years, and I've seen similar decisions from Principal Porter. There's a pattern here." The teacher went on to share examples of other instances where Porter had disproportionately targeted minority students, her words adding weight to Clara's argument. The momentum shifted. More voices joined in, sharing stories of feeling unfairly treated or overlooked. What began as a hearing about one suspension turned into a broader reckoning of the school's leadership. Porter's attempts to defend himself grew weaker with each revelation. He argued that he was simply enforcing the rules, but it became clear that his approach to discipline was inconsistent and often unfair. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions growing more serious by the minute. Finally, the chairperson spoke. Given the evidence presented today, it's clear that James's suspension was not justified. Effective immediately, the suspension will be expunged from his record. Relief washed over James as the decision was announced, but the board wasn't finished. Furthermore, the chairperson continued, we will conduct a full investigation into the disciplinary practices at this school to ensure fairness and accountability moving forward. Porter's face paled as the implications of their decision sank in. He had underestimated James, Clara, and the growing wave of support behind them. After the hearing, students and teachers surrounded James, congratulating him and thanking him for standing up not just for himself, but for the entire school community. Mia grinned, clapping James on the back. I told you we'd get justice, she said. James smiled, though his expression carried a mix of relief and determination. This isn't just about me, he replied. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The victory was sweet, but it was also a call to action. James knew that the fight for fairness wasn't over, but for the first time he felt the full strength of his voice and the power it carried. The weeks following the school board hearing marked a significant shift at Lincoln High. James Carter's suspension had been officially lifted, and his record was cleared. Word of his resilience and determination spread not just within the school, but throughout the local community. Students who once felt powerless against Principal Porter's authority now saw James as a symbol of strength and change. James returned to school with his head held high, greeted by smiles, nods, and even applause from his peers. You did it, James, Mia exclaimed as she met him at the front entrance. Her excitement was infectious, and James couldn't help but grin. But Principal Porter's reaction was far less welcoming. Though he remained in his position during the ongoing investigation, his authority was visibly diminished. Teachers and students alike began challenging his decisions, and the school board's scrutiny left little room for him to act on personal biases. For James, the victory wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about reclaiming his narrative and proving that resilience and integrity could overcome injustice. His focus now turned to the upcoming Community Awards ceremony, where he would be recognized for his leadership and the successful fundraiser he had organized during his suspension. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the school auditorium was packed with students, parents, and faculty members. The air buzzed with excitement as the crowd awaited the announcement of the Special Recognition Awards. James sat in the front row, his mother Clara by his side. She squeezed his hand, her pride evident in the way her eyes sparkled. Ladies and gentlemen, the host began, stepping onto the stage, tonight we celebrate individuals who have demonstrated exceptional character and leadership. Our next honoree embodies these qualities and more. James's name was called, and the auditorium erupted into applause. As he made his way to the stage, he couldn't help but glance at Principal Porter, who sat stiffly near the back of the room. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and while Porter's expression remained unreadable, James felt no need for acknowledgement. This moment wasn't about Porter. It was about everything James had achieved despite him. Taking the microphone, James paused, letting the applause settle. Thank you, he began, his voice steady and clear. This recognition isn't just for me. It's for everyone who believed in me when it felt like the odds were stacked against us. It's a reminder that when we stand together and speak up, we can create change. His speech touched on themes of perseverance, community, and the importance of standing up for what's right. He shared the lessons he'd learned through his struggles and thanked those who had supported him along the way, from his mother to Mia to the teachers who had spoken out. The audience gave him a standing ovation as he stepped off the stage, but the most meaningful moment came later that evening. As the crowd dispersed, students and teachers approached James to share their gratitude. "You've inspired so many of us," said a younger student, her voice filled with emotion. "You made us believe that we don't have to stay silent when something's wrong." Even teachers who had once stayed neutral were moved. Mr. Ramirez, the history teacher who had mentored James, smiled warmly. "You've shown everyone what leadership really looks like," he said. But the night wasn't over. As James and Clara made their way toward the exit, Principal Porter approached them, his posture rigid and his expression strained. "James," Porter began, his voice lower than usual, I want to say congratulations. You've handled yourself well." The words felt forced, and James could sense the internal conflict Porter was grappling with. Clara gave Porter a sharp look, but allowed James to respond. "Thank you," James said simply, his tone polite but firm. "I hope this experience has taught all of us something about fairness and accountability." Porter nodded awkwardly before walking away, leaving James and Clara to continue their celebration. Could take pride in the fact that he had turned adversity into triumph, inspiring those around him to believe in the power of resilience and truth. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as the graduating class of Lincoln High prepared for their big moment. Family members filled the rows, their cheers and clapping creating an electric atmosphere. James Carter adjusted his cap in the lineup, his heart beating with a mix of pride and disbelief. The journey to this day had been far from easy, but standing here among his classmates, he felt every bit of the strength it had taken to reach this moment. The ceremony began with the principal's address, and James couldn't help but notice how much less commanding Principal Porter seemed now. The once imposing figure looked smaller somehow, his words lacking the force they once carried. As Porter spoke, his eyes skimmed over James briefly, but he avoided lingering. James wasn't surprised. The investigation into Porter's disciplinary actions had made waves, and though the principal had remained in his position, his unchecked power was no longer absolute. As the names of graduates were called, the audience erupted into cheers for each student. When James's name was announced, the room seemed to pause before bursting into thunderous applause. Students who had rallied behind him cheered the loudest, while teachers nodded with pride. James's mother, Clara, stood in the crowd, her hands clasped together as tears of joy streamed down her face. Walking across the stage, James held his head high, shaking hands with Porter as protocol dictated. The handshake was brief, perfunctory, and James noticed the faint stiffness in Porter's expression. But he had no time to dwell on it. His moment was just beginning. Once all the students had received their diplomas, the host of the ceremony stepped up to the podium. "This year, we have the honor of hearing from a truly exceptional graduate," she announced. "Someone who has demonstrated resilience, leadership, and a commitment to making a difference. Please welcome your class speaker, James Carter." The auditorium erupted into applause once again as James stepped forward. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. The noise quieted, and the room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. "Good evening, everyone," James began, his voice clear and steady. "Standing here today feels like a dream, but this moment isn't just about me. It's about all of us, the class of Lincoln High, and the challenges we've faced together." He paused, scanning the room. "For me, this journey hasn't been easy. There were moments when I felt like giving up, when it seemed like the obstacles were too great to overcome. But through those moments, I learned something important. Our strength isn't just in what we achieve. but in how we stand up when we're knocked down. James continued, reflecting on the support he'd received from his friends, family, and teachers. He spoke about the importance of standing together against injustice, using his story as an example of how resilience and integrity could lead to change. Lincoln High isn't perfect, he said, his tone firm yet hopeful. But I believe it can become a place where every student feels seen, valued, and supported. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with us, with how we choose to treat each other every single day. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on to every word. Even Principal Porter couldn't hide the impact of James's speech, his rigid posture softening ever so slightly as he listened. As James concluded his speech, he offered one final thought. "We all have the power to make a difference," he said. "No matter where we come from, no matter what challenges we face, we can choose to be the change we want to see. And that's exactly what I plan to do." The audience rose to their feet, the applause echoing throughout the auditorium. James stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed but grateful. He had delivered more than just a graduation speech. He had shared a vision of hope and unity that would stay with those in the room for years to come. As the ceremony came to a close, James joined his classmates in tossing their caps into the air, the room filled with cheers and laughter. Clara met him outside, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks, Mom," he replied, his smile wide and genuine. For James, graduation was more than just an end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would continue to rise above challenges and make his mark on the world. The air was thick with anticipation as James Carter approached the podium for what many had been calling the highlight of the graduation ceremony. His classmates and their families sat forward in their chairs, their eyes locked on the young man who had become a symbol of perseverance and hope for Lincoln High. James took a deep breath, steadied himself, and began to speak. "Good evening, everyone," he started, his voice calm yet filled with purpose. "It's an honor to stand here today, not just as a graduate, but as someone who has learned the true meaning of resilience." The audience quieted, drawn in by his sincerity. "When I first walked through the doors of this school, I never imagined how much I would be tested, not just academically, but personally. There were times when I felt invisible, dismissed, or judged unfairly. But those moments taught me something invaluable, that our character is defined not by the challenges we face, but by how we choose to rise above them." James paused, glancing across the room. His classmates, once distant faces in crowded hallways, now looked at him with admiration and respect. "I want to thank the people who stood by me, even when it wasn't easy. My mom, who has been my rock through everything. My friends, who reminded me to keep going. And the teachers who believed in me when I doubted myself." The room felt still, as if every word he spoke carried the weight of a shared truth. "But this isn't just my story," he continued. "It's ours. Every single one of us here today has faced obstacles, whether visible or invisible, and yet here we are, together, ready to step into a future we get to shape." He then shifted his focus to the importance of unity and respect, drawing from his experiences. This school, like many others, has its flaws, but it also has potential. We've seen how standing up for what's right can create change, and I hope we carry that lesson with us wherever we go. James's voice grew steadier as he reached the climax of his speech. "We live in a world that sometimes tells us we're not enough, but I'm here to tell you, every single one of you, that you are. Your dreams matter. Your voice matters. And the impact you can have is greater than you'll ever know." The crowd erupted into applause, but James wasn't finished. "As we leave this place and step into the next chapter of our lives, let's remember that true strength lies in lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. Let's be the change we wish to see, because together, we are unstoppable." The standing ovation that followed was immediate and thunderous. Tears glistened in the eyes of proud parents and teachers, and even some classmates who hadn't known James personally found themselves moved by his words. James stepped down from the stage, his heart full. He had spoken not just as a graduate, but as a leader, a role he had earned through his unwavering courage and integrity. As the final moments of the ceremony unfolded, James Carter stood among his peers, feeling the weight of the journey he had traveled. From the unjust suspension to standing as the graduation speaker, his life had taken a path he hadn't anticipated, but one that had made him stronger. The lesson wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed the journey, the students who had rallied behind him, the teachers who had found their voices to stand up for fairness, and even Principal Porter, who now carried the burden of self-reflection. For James, the greatest victory wasn't the applause or recognition. It was the knowledge that he had stayed true to his values. He had chosen resilience over anger, action over defeat, and integrity over shortcuts. It wasn't just about clearing his name, but about showing the power of standing up for what's right, even when it felt like the odds were against him. Principal Porter, watching from the back of the room, couldn't ignore the impact James had made. Though he had resisted change for years, the events of the past months had forced him to see the cracks in his leadership. Whether he admitted it or not, Porter knew that James had reshaped the school's future. As James and his mother walked home together that evening, Clara glanced at her son with pride. "You've proven something important, James," she said, "that the right path isn't always the easy one, but it's always worth it." James smiled, his heart light with the truth of her words. His story wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was a testament to the power of resilience, community, and the belief that one person can make a difference.